Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Chris, good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Thank you for having me back on to talk with you.
I was going back to remember the last time we got together. It was in June of 2021,
Yep.
which I guess was 2 books ago. And that one was on American propaganda, as I recall.
Yeah, so the last one was on American propaganda, and then the other one was on tyranny coming home, so foreign interventions leading to reductions in liberty at home. And
Yeah, I guess it was tyranny coming home.
we talked a little bit about propaganda too. So.
Yeah. Like all these subjects actually go together.
Yes.
But speaking about both propaganda and more importantly, tyranny coming home, I just had Thomas Massey on the show, and he was, I believe, an instrumental part in getting the Republican leadership to concede to this new subcommittee, which is part of judiciary, that's going to look at the weaponization of the FBI, CIA, and other agencies against Americans, surveillance and that kind of thing. And our entire conversation was, why does Congress even have to do that? They have a responsibility to make sure that these alphabet agencies don't get crazy, but I take it as good news that they're at least going to raise the question.
Yeah, certainly. So people are referring to this as the current day or modern day Church Committee.
Yeah.
The Church Committee, of course, was in the 70s and investigated FBI, CIA abuses of power along the very lines you just laid out. And the kind of shocking part on the one hand, but perhaps not so shocking if you understand how this apparatus works, is, well, all this stuff is really the same as it was when the Church Committee investigated. It's just more efficient technology, which is actually what makes it scarier in some sense.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a good sign to my way of thinking.
Yeah, like from Massey's point of view and mine as well, like they're if you actually believe in the structure of divided government, Congress has a responsibility of oversight and a responsibility to legislate what it is that these agencies can and can't do. But you would probably appreciate the fact, this is speculation on my part, but I've seen this even when I worked on the Hill, that all of these oversight committees, no matter what the agency is, you don't get on that committee in order to hold that agency accountable. You get on that committee to bring home more stuff, and it becomes more of a collusion than an oversight. So like for all of the work that the Church Committee did, nothing's changed except that our government's more weaponized against us.
Yep. And the checks they did put in place, something like the FISA court, for instance, again, without oversight, the executive branch can just circumvent that. We saw that during the Bush administration with the war on terror, that with simple changes in how things are classified. So, classifying a intelligence program as a covert action instead of an intelligence action means that you don't have to inform the entire intelligence committee, which is supposed to oversee. You just have to inform the Gang of Eight, so the leadership, and it's meant to inform them, not to open it up to debate and push back and scrutiny, which basically means that there's no oversight at all. And you take that in addition to the point you're making, that oftentimes the very people that are tasked with oversight have an incentive to perpetuate the behaviors because it benefits them and their constituents. You can see how it's quite problematic.
Yeah, I'm sure your research has covered the ecosystem of all of these pieces of the military economy that get distributed across the political map, so that Republicans and Democrats and people from this district and this region, so it's not concentrated. It's everybody has a stake in more war.
Yep, and you see that throughout. I refer to this as peak cronyism. It is the height of cronyism because it touches almost every aspect of economic activity. We don't think about it that way. People think about the military-industrial complex, and they think about Boeing and Raytheon, and those are important aspects of it, certainly. But to run this, you need healthcare providers, you need accountants, you need office supplies, all of these different industries. You need labor, of course, that is pulled from the private sector, is kind of touched by the military-industrial complex. There's no part of life it doesn't touch. And the point you raise is a good one. You look at something like the F-35 fighter jet, and it's actually brilliant the way it's set up from the perspective of the private firm in Congress. It's spread over something like 40 plus states that produce different parts of it. And so what representative is ever going to push back on this and say, no, we can't do this anymore? Because it would literally be taking away jobs from their constituents. And so it creates these too big to fail projects within government that just perpetuate through time.
So I think most politicians would suggest we're at peace right now. You and I would probably quibble with that characterization of where the United States is. But in a peacetime economy, how big is the military economy as a percentage of our total, either as a percentage of our budget, but as a percentage of GDP?
GDP is usually the measure. Yeah, during peacetime, it's usually anywhere from 2 to 4%. And people will say, well, that's small. That's relatively small. Well, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that, of course, our GDP is enormous. And as GDP grows, that spending increases. And it's unclear you even need that much. I mean, that's one percentage of GDP is one way of thinking about it. Another way to think about it is in terms of what other governments are spending. And when you think about it in those terms, the United States is something like more than the next 9 countries combined. That includes, by the way, China and Russia. And so when you look at this in absolute dollar terms, the United States government is quite large. From that perspective. And so people say, well, we should just increase it to 5% because that's still relatively small. And again, it's a percentage that certainly sounds small. But you start, again, thinking about all the consequences that the ripple effects it has. And those things are not measurable. It's not possible to measure, for instance, a entrepreneur who otherwise would be producing some technological innovation that would benefit people in a market, who now shift their focus to placating political gatekeepers. And we see this constantly, even among companies that we don't think about, like Amazon, Google, of course, these big data, big tech companies that make a significant portion of their revenue through government contracts and actually have separate arms of their business set up to interact with government. So I think Google's branch is called like Google Public, or if I'm remembering correctly. And that the purpose of that is to specialize in government contracts, to hire people who have security clearance. And that shifts the nature of those companies, but also leads to a perverse set of consequences going back to things like surveillance. And so, a lot of people on the left have recently been critiquing what they call surveillance capitalism. And they don't like the fact that Google, Facebook, Apple collect data on us when you and I, for instance, use our smartphones. And you can think about that and think about what the implications of that are. But in a purely private market, Google, Facebook, Amazon, they can't show up at your door and kick it in. They can't throw you in jail. They can't extract money out of your bank account and then, under some notion of civil asset forfeiture and then make you prove you're innocent. Government can. So one of the big risks, of course, is when you get these entanglements between government and these big tech firms, that the concerns of people that are worried about what they call surveillance capitalism are actually legit. And they're legit not because private firms are collecting data, but because they become an appendage of the surveillance apparatus, and then government can use that data for entirely different reasons than targeting an advertisement to you like social media companies do.
Yeah, getting me to buy Hawaiian shirts with my cats imprinted on them is not the worst outcome of all this data surveillance, but Facebook definitely knows that I want that. But this gets to, back to this committee and all of this debate about the Twitter files. I'm starting to realize, and I probably should have known this, but the all of that censorship comes from the national security apparatus of the government. It's not something else, and a lot of those spokespeople that they have in media that either worked for the FBI or the CIA, the Department of Defense, Homeland Security. It's an echo chamber. So like the incentive for big tech to cooperate, collude, view the defense machine as a source of revenue, like that's bigger than it ever was. And you start to realize that when you watch, like, so why is big tech complying with all of these demands to censor the narrative? Well, it's a business decision as much as anything else.
Yep. Combined with, oftentimes when they don't, the government accesses it anyway. We know during the Bush administration, for instance, that in addition to partnering with telecommunications companies and big data companies, that the NSA was tapping into data sources of Yahoo and others without them even knowing it. And the only reason we do know it, of course, is because of the Snowden revelations.
Yeah.
And that's one of the crucial roles that whistleblowers play. People are very kind of torn, and even defenders of liberty often say, well, it's bad, certain whistleblowing is bad, or much of whistleblowing is bad because it threatens national security. And of course, politicians and policymakers hate it. There's blood on their hands. It's the minute whistleblowers come out with something, it's the worst of the worst. And really what they're doing in many cases is pulling back the curtains on the actual operations of it, and that's why they don't like it.
Right.
Oftentimes you go back before Snowden, you go to Daniel Ellsberg, of course, and what did they do? They revealed systematic lying by government. And it wasn't just systematic lying about, mundane waste of resources, even though that's important too. It was about war and prolonging a war and then systematically lying to the American populace to perpetuate that war and to insulate themselves from criticism, which is really at the foundation of any free society. To the extent that a free society is based on the citizenry driving the political machinery, meaning that to the extent we have representatives, they're supposed to represent our interests. What the control of information does is invert that relationship. It basically says, look, we cannot rely on the citizenry to be judges of what's right, what's good, what they want. Oftentimes the logic is, well, they don't know. They can't handle the truth kind of logic, right?
Yeah.
And so we need to control it. But that undermines the entire system then in terms of having the citizenry drive the process. If citizens aren't robust enough to handle those difficult situations, then we're going to end up in an authoritarian situation because we are voluntarily granting authoritarian power to a small group of elites.
Yeah. And we're wrestling with that now, and it seems... I know this has always been this way, but it seems particularly intense right now, and it's probably a question of the size and scope of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, and I should say just the very industrial organization of it. One of the things I've come to realize, and this sounds quite radical to people, and it is only if you treat it as radical. But to my view, the radical position is I can empower this Leviathan to surveil everything people do, but also constrain it. To me, that's a very radical. That's more radical than what I'm about to say. And what I'm about to say is the very nature of the entity is to expand, is to abuse powers that are given to it, not even because there's malicious people in charge, because of how bureaucracies work, because how mission creep works, because how human beings operate, even when it's human error. And you combine all these things together, and all of the dynamics push towards expansion, not contraction. And why does that matter? Well, one of the things I think lovers of liberty need to think about deeply is, can you actually constrain this beast? Can you actually put limits on it? And does pulling it back even a little bit actually do anything in terms of sustaining that change? And those are hard questions, but I think they're important questions to ask. And you might think, for instance, what happens if we didn't have an NSA? Would somehow the world unravel? We haven't always had an NSA, by the way. So the world existed a long time pre-NSA. The NSA in its current form, I think, was formed in 1952. It went through, like all bureaus, it went through various rebrandings and merging into other bureaus before that. But in terms of the surveillance apparatus in the United States, it's relatively young. So really during the first and then really the Second World War is when it really matures and comes into its own. And in the Cold War, it really ramps up because you needed this surveillance apparatus to protect against the communist threat, which is around every corner. Because when you're fighting an ideology, it's not a person, it's a set of ideas, which means I have to monitor everyone's ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah,
by the way, you and I are old enough to remember when we didn't have a Department of Homeland Security created by a Republican president.
Yep.
And I was involved in public policy at the time, and it didn't take rocket science to predict that would become a weapon that would be used against Americans. And now there's plenty of conservatives and obviously libertarians, but conservatives are like, wait, all of these agencies are now going after us. And I'm like, Well, this is the dilemma that you're describing, and I talk to conservatives all the time about this because they want, and this is the main thesis of your book, can you have a classical liberal constrained government and a big defense apparatus that has aspirations to be involved in all of these wars? And your conclusion is you can't do both.
Yes. So the idea of a liberal empire, as some people refer to it, is internally inconsistent, which is the very nature of empire, the apparatus domestically, but also imperialism, which is the use of that apparatus to project force abroad and project whether it's ideology, whether it's achieving certain goals in other societies or some combination thereof typically, is inherently illiberal. And all of the most cherished values that liberals broadly construed, I'm using liberals here in the classical sense.
Let's define liberalism, because it obviously the word can be confusing.
Yes, certainly. Yeah. So when I talk about liberalism, it's the political philosophy of individual freedom. So John Locke, of course, writing in the 1600s, is considered the father of liberalism, and there's many thinkers that have followed in his footsteps. But liberalism is a political philosophy and emphasizes the primacy of individual freedom and liberty, so the dignity of the individual, and then everything that comes out of that, the ability to associate with other people, the ability to engage in economic interactions freely with other people who also engage with you freely, the ability to move where you want to move, meaning that you don't have government-created artificial barriers to movement across geographic space. Of course, you have property rights, which influence where you can move and how you can move. But there's no one saying you are not allowed to travel over there because I tell you cannot. Or people cannot cross this line because they happen to be born over there, or they're in this category of people. So it's a very cosmopolitan tradition in terms of being open to other people and welcoming, and thinking about what institutional arrangements are conducive to those things.
I generally agree with that, except I do want a wall between us and California, because it's just getting too crazy over there. At Kibbe on Liberty, freedom is a lifestyle 24/7, something you live and breathe and wear every day. If that describes you, you need the very best Liberty swag in the market today, just like this shirt I happen to be wearing. Go to freethepeople.org/KOL and check out our exciting merch. You too can love liberty and look cool. And I always have to use the classical liberalism, like classic Coke, because the word I guess liberalism, as in left liberalism, has been replaced by progressivism, but it's hard to keep up with the nomenclature.
Yeah, right.
We classical liberals or liberals don't really fit into that left versus right thing anyway.
That's right.
Particularly on a subject like this, because I think I'm fascinated that in a lot of ways, conservatives are becoming the new skeptics of empire building and this entire surveillance apparatus, and the left, which used to be some of the most thoughtful critics of that, are now sort of just accepting it as, well, if the FBI says it's true, it must be true.
Yep.
I don't know where that came from, but it's perhaps successful propaganda.
Yeah, I think it's a complex trajectory, and of course, throughout American history, it's ebbed and flowed. So, of course, the old right, so Robert Taft, was very skeptical of a proactive foreign policy, and so that tradition is certainly there in the Republican Party as we go back further. But you're certainly right that the neoconservatives that really peaked under George W. Bush, but you see elements of that there even before the Bush administration, really were the drivers of during that time period. So we're talking here, even before 9/11, but 9/11 opened the door for them to kind of implement their vision. A very expansive, unconstrained security empire apparatus. And there you had people on
they migrated from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party
that's right.
as an opportunistic
certainly. Political opportunism, yeah. And during the Bush presidency, you did have pushback up from the left. You also had an anti-war movement. When Obama gets elected, now the anti-war movement, I'm talking outside of the walls of Congress, of course, among the populace, certainly wasn't as large as Vietnam, for instance, but it existed.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you just went to the White House when Bush was president, you would have seen people outside almost on a daily basis outside the White House. Obama gets elected.
I did some of those protests.
There you go. Yeah. There you go. So you saw it firsthand.
Yeah.
Obama gets elected, and almost overnight that goes away. The anti-war movement goes away, and many of the criticisms of the kind of imperialism that had really ramped up under Bush went away. It's not like Obama was this staunch anti-war, anti-imperialistic president. If anything, you can make the argument on many margins, he did the opposite. So from one thing he did, for instance, is because he didn't want, one of the things he did push back on is we don't want to send as many troops abroad. But what did he replace those with? Drones.
Yeah.
And so he was the main proponent, his administration was the main proponent of ramping up the drone war. And so I was getting at earlier in terms of ratcheting it back. It's very hard, I think, to pull it back permanently because the very nature of the entity is to continually push and expand. And, I don't know if it was then Trump's rhetoric against both some of these agencies, but also at least rhetorically, he was very skeptical of war and imperialism that kind of contributed to that shift on the left. But where we are now is, as you put it quite nicely, we have this weird pivot.
Yeah. There's also this dynamic. I don't know what you think about this, but it seems like you could look at George W. Bush, certainly Obama, Trump. They all ran very skeptical of foreign intervention. There's too much war and too much blood and treasure being shed. And they transform in office, and I vividly remember the transformation from Bush on the campaign trail to 9/11. But Obama did the same thing. So like what we now call the deep state really has its tentacles in everything. It even struck me as Trump was more schizophrenic, like he's very bipolar on defense because he wants to be tough, but at the same time he's a critic of this stuff. But for all of his rhetoric, he didn't get much done. So this, I guess, is the basis of this book. That seems like a good jumping off point. In search of monsters to destroy, the folly of American empire and the paths to peace. And I want to get to the peace part, but define American empire, because I was listening to your pod with our friend Peter Betke, and it's not like we are so heavily involved in Ukraine in hopes that Ukraine becomes the 52nd state.
Yes, right.
That's not the kind of empire we're talking about.
And so that's what makes the American empire unique, is that historically empires one of the key components has been territorial acquisition. And of course, in the early days of America, you did see that westward expansion and so on. And then, of course, wanting to protect Latin America from external intervention from other countries, not necessarily to claim all the territory, but kind of make it in many cases satellite or client states of the United States. But and academics debate rhetoric and terminology like academics do. And so there is this huge debate in political science about, is America an empire? I think it is. And the reason I think it is because it views itself, and many other countries view it, and by the way, many citizens view it, as the entity that holds together the world, that its projection of power around the world, some mix of military force, economic power wielded by government, not by individuals left to their own devices, is necessary to kind of this glue that holds the world together. And you hear this rhetoric both from policymakers, but also from many academics of the liberal order. And the liberal order is a result of design. It's a result of a small group of elites in America that project their power. And so while the American empire doesn't acquire territory as empires of the past, it does project power all around the world. And I mean all around the world. It's certainly military force, let alone economic force through government, or at least partnering with government. And what it does is maintains a set of kind of client states. They don't call them that, but you look, for instance, on where foreign aid goes. You look at where arms sales go. And so then you think about, well, what are the characteristics of this empire? Well, one of it's a significant military apparatus at home. Another is a culture of militarism. So you see this right now with Ukraine, irregardless of where you stand on it. You can either say, well, we should do nothing, or I think it's good that we send some support. Doesn't matter. If you critique the U.S. government at all, or say, like, what are we doing? You don't have to, all of a sudden you're a Putin apologist.
Yeah.
You want Putin to take over the world. And this is the kind of playbook that happens if you look historically, going back to our point about propaganda and information, throughout wars, which is anyone that tries to not even push back against having a military or against the military doing anything or aid doing anything, they are labeled as a traitor, unpatriotic, and so on. And that is highly problematic from the standpoint of a citizenry being skeptical of everything their government does. And so you have a culture of militarism. You see this just in our daily lives. If you think about sporting events in the United States, go to a professional or even a college, in many cases, sporting event, what do you see at the beginning? Well, of course, there's the color guard and all that, but oftentimes you see things like a welcoming home of a member of the military who surprises their family, some kind of show of nationalism and patriotism. You walk through airports or wherever, and you see people in uniform. Thank you for your service. Most of these people you're thanking probably haven't even seen combat or the front lines.
You're calling it a culture of militarism, but like in those specific examples, and I think in a lot of these examples, these are financed propaganda programs, like the military finances, like the Pledge of Allegiance and the color guard and all of that.
Yes, and they paid sports teams, paid
Yeah.
patriotism, of course. They paid the NFL
Yeah.
and a host of other. But I think it's even deeper than that. I can't speak to the present day, but when I was in grammar school, it was the first Gulf War. And I can remember, and this wasn't financed by government, but I can remember our teachers saying, well, you got to wear, it was yellow ribbons at the time. So you had to wear a yellow ribbon pin. You had to tie them. Everyone tied them around trees. And, kind of was a kid. I'm like, what's going on? Everyone else is wearing a ribbon. I better wear a ribbon. You stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
The seeds
and so
of
on.
your radical libertarianism were planted then.
Without realizing it.
Yeah.
But I just want to come back to your point, because it is an important one, which is there is the aspects that are not driven by government purposely, but there are those that are. And the sports one is one. And going back to what we were talking about earlier about information control, something that many people don't realize is that government, again, going back to the world wars, but it still exists today, is heavily involved in Hollywood.
Yeah.
So, just to give it a recent example, you look at the recent Top Gun movie, and, if you do a little research on this, there's a part of the Pentagon that works with Hollywood, and basically they subsidize them. So if you're making a movie, and it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to make an action movie, and if you can get access to military bases, military equipment, either free of charge or heavily discounted, it's a massive subsidy.
Yeah.
But of course, it comes with a price. And what's the price? The division within the Pentagon gets to review the script.
Yeah.
They can't force you to make changes, but they can say, hey, you want to use our stuff. And so you see this throughout. And some movies like you wouldn't even think about. So Top Gun was like, oh, that's a military movie. Transformers. That's another one.
Like Top Gun, and this is I just watched, I guess it was a third season of Jack Ryan. I don't know if you watch this show, but I realized this, and it's absolutely true in Top Gun and Homeland, which is a show that I really enjoyed. Same dynamic there, but the theme, and this gets to the general thesis of your research paradigm. We are to believe that there is some sort of America-loving, we must do the right thing renegade within these government agencies that are willing to risk their careers, jail time, their lives in order to do the right thing. And any sort of even common sense understanding of bureaucracy is to suggest that the system weeds those people out. If those people exist, like they're going to risk everything and go to jail because their agency specifically is trying to destroy them. I mean, it's the whole story of Top Gun.
Yep.
is, Tom Cruise is going to do the right thing. I forget what his name is in the movie, and he gets fired, he gets jailed, and then he's like, I'm going to risk my life to prove that I'm right. I'm like, it's absurd. It gets to the incentive problem.
Yep.
And this idea that we're going to put angels in charge who are always going to do the right thing, and that it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and that's the presumption of much of government in general, but the military or national security apparatus is it's a government program, but it's a special one, and it's special precisely because of the activities it undertakes, its ability to do real harm to human beings, both domestically and abroad. But you're certainly right.
You have a special skill to bring all of our cats into our podcast.
Yes, that's right.
And he doesn't care.
Since I'm a cat person, so. But going back to empire for a moment, one of the things I just wanted to touch upon. So you have the domestic apparatus, you have the culture that's partially emergent on its own, from when our schooling and all that, partially financed by government and by other government agencies. But the other aspect of this is I just want to mention special operations and arms sales and aid. And special operations are these small-scale forces, of course, that they don't occupy a country. They're in and out. But, I don't think people realize the extent of the use of special operations in the United States. On any given year, it's something like they intervene in various ways in something like 70 to 80% of the countries around the world. Yeah. And that's what I mean about the broadcast, the reach of power. And Americans don't know about this. Members of Congress aren't checking this. It's just, it's business as usual kind of thing. Yeah. And then arms sales. The U.S. government is the largest arms dealer in the world. Now, some of those weapons are transferred to other democracies, but again, those can still be used be used for defense, but also for offense. But some of them go to the worst governments in the world, so like the Saudis and others. And from that standpoint, you can make the argument that in the name of promoting a liberal order, you're actually contributing to illiberalism. You are giving weapons of force, weapons of control over other human beings to illiberal governments. And so I think that's a nice example of what I'm trying to get at when I say the idea of a liberal empire is internally inconsistent because it inherently entails illiberal behaviors on a global scale.
Thank you for joining me today on Kibbe on Liberty and for being part of our fiercely independent audience. Every week, my organization, Free the People, partners with Blaze TV to bring you this show. My guests bring smart perspectives on everything from current events to timeless philosophical debates. If you like what you hear, go to freethepeople.org/KOL and support Kibbe on Liberty so we can continue to produce these honest conversations with interesting people. Now, let's get back to it. There seems like let's jump back to the Saudis just for a second, because a lot of people believe, and there's certainly some truth to this, that we can't criticize that Republican presidents, Democratic presidents, it doesn't matter. We can't criticize what the Saudis are doing in Yemen because we need the oil. But it may be more important to us, or equally important, that those arms sales keep flowing, because it's such a fundamental part of the economy. What do you think the real story is?
I think it's probably a combination. So I think the logic of military Keynesianism is true. And what I mean by that is I don't mean economically true, I mean it politically true. Yeah. Meaning that so the idea of military Keynesianism is the idea of, military spending is a win-win domestically because it creates jobs, but it also creates defense. And so therefore, this is a great thing. It spurs economic development through, rather than government building bridges. We're creating jobs while also creating defense. And of course, people have talked about this since World War II, right? The kind of myth that World War II got us out of the Great Depression and all that is based on that logic. So that certainly exists. But I also think there are oil interests certainly at play. And I think it's true, by the way. I think that if the United States government didn't do certain things, certain goods and services would go up in price. No doubt. So then the question becomes, people have to reflect on what kind of society they want to live in, what their values are, and what they're willing to trade off. No doubt that if you intervene abroad if you engage in control and conquest of other societies, you can get more resources. Throughout history, that's been one of the driving factors behind conquest.
Yeah.
And so, I don't think you have to, I think you can accept that reality, but also say, well, it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah. So we've talked about so the way that my simple mind processes the world, and this goes back to the George Mason tradition that I was trained in. When I look at any policy, I did this a lot during the so-called war on COVID. I look at incentives, and that's sort of the whole James Buchanan public choice way of understanding that, even if we know what the right thing to do is, it may well be that political incentives are not ever aligned with the public good. But the other one, and this gets more fundamental to your critique of empire, is the knowledge problem, sort of the Hayekian understanding that central planners don't ever know nearly enough to redesign complex systems, and the more they try to, the more they screw things up. Because our empire today is not about taking over something and plundering it in the old sense of resource extraction. It's about exporting democracy and helping people. But it seems like we always just make things worse.
Yeah, and so the way I leverage this in this book and my work in general is, I think the knowledge problem when it comes to foreign policy and intervention is even more significant than Hayek talked about. Hayek was talking about central planning within a nation. So what would real world socialism look like when you actually tried to implement this? And his argument, going back of course to Mises before Hayek, was there's no way for planners to gain access to economic knowledge to determine how to best allocate scarce resources to their highest valued use. That is an outcome of social cooperation of markets. It's not something that can exist absent those interactions. It's emergent. And that's relevant for the defense sector for the reasons you and I were just talking about. Claims that somehow the military sector can create economic development assume that those in the military sector know how to allocate scarce resources to create economic development. So that's the Misesian Hayekian knowledge problem proper. But there's another aspect to it, which is, do we actually know how to design the overarching institutions of society? Certainly, I think we could think about, and you and I talked a little bit about this when we were defining liberalism. What are the general features of free society? And people might even disagree about some of those, by the way. But let's assume we could come up with a list of characteristics. They'd be very broad. But then what does it actually mean to establish institutions in society that do those things? And to my way of thinking, those are not objects of design. They are largely spontaneous and emergent. We think about them as objects of design. And the entire empire apparatus is grounded in that. It's grounded in a Hobbesian view of the world. Life is nasty, brutish, and short. People want to kill each other. Someone has to bring order. Who's going to bring order? Leviathan. And without Leviathan, it's chaos. But one of the main insights of Buchanan, Mises, and Hayek, and it's one of the key themes in the liberal tradition, is an emphasis on spontaneous order. That through human interaction, things emerge that we couldn't even imagine and design absent those interactions. And that then makes you realize, once you appreciate that point, that what passes oftentimes as order is actually chaos. That in trying to control complex systems, you are actually generating chaos in the world. Again, in economic terms, real-world socialism being perhaps the most stark example of that. We're going to rationalize economic production and bring order. What do you get? Squalor and misery.
Yeah.
What happens when you try to bring order to the world? Oftentimes squalor and misery.
Well, we just had a 20-year experiment in Afghanistan of central planning, and most people, including myself, I was shocked that it unraveled in days. Like, I didn't expect them to establish a liberal democracy, even though there were those great photo ops of people with the stained thumbs voting, and that must have been like 2004. So I don't forget when
early
it was.
on. Yes,
early on, and they accomplished absolutely nothing. But I would argue they accomplished less than nothing, because you have all of that destruction and all of those lives lost and all of that malinvestment that is now in the hands of really bad guys. And yet did we learn anything from that?
Yeah, well, first of all, one thing to note, which people oftentimes forget, and this I think highlights one of the issues of trying to bring order to the world. We have to remember that Afghanistan in 2001 had its origins in U.S. interventions to fight the Soviets when they invaded Afghanistan in the late 70s. Of course, the U.S. government didn't engage directly. It was a proxy war, like many of the wars during the Cold War, where they funneled weapons through Pakistan into the hands of, at the time, they were called freedom fighters because they were on the side of the United States. They pushed out the Soviet Union. And then, of course, that left a power vacuum, which led to that. So you think just from that you would have, there's a reason Afghanistan kind of has the moniker graveyard of empires before the United States intervened, because there was the Soviets, there was the British before that, and then America, of course, was the most recent kind of victim of the graveyard, if you will. But I agree with you. When the U.S. exited, I didn't have high hopes, but it was amazing how quickly it actually collapsed. It was embarrassingly quick. And I was hopeful for a little bit.
And by the way, my classical liberal friends who were running the what amounts to the libertarian think tank in Kabul were surprised at how quickly it unraveled.
So even people on the ground. Yeah.
It wasn't like I wouldn't have enough knowledge to have known, but even he didn't know.
Right. Yeah, it was amazing. And the reason I was hopeful is because I'm like, all right, given all this terribleness, now this is going to pull back the curtain, and people are going to reflect on, let's actually have a conversation about what this is all about. And of course, that was, to the extent that happened, all was very short-lived because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and then the response to that. And then now the rhetoric is, well, we have to pivot away from the war on terror. Now the concerns are Russia and China. And so now you hear all this talk of, well, we need to have, again, bring order to the world, and all this talk of balancing. The way people talk about the world in Washington, D.C., whether it's the economy, the kind of hydraulic view of the economy, it's too hot or too cold, and you pull this lever or that lever, and you just get like a light switch. They also talk about international relations that way. We need to balance power as if there's a scale, and if you just put the right amount of weight over here, you get perfect balance where you're going to have peace and order. And we know, the experts know exactly the mind round weight to put on there.
It's a science. The science is settled. All we have to do is sort of jigger the
and just getting the right people and the right resources. Yeah. And if something goes wrong, it's never, well, we actually can't do this, or let's reflect on whether we can do this. It's always, well, they messed up because they're not the right people, or we didn't have enough funding. And when you have that kind of mentality, of course, you're going to end up doing the same thing over and over again because you never reflect on the root issues.
Yeah, so we've talked, and I've tried to explain. I have this project called the Deadly Isms, where I'm trying to build out the difference between using violence as the principle of organizing society, and you could list all of the isms that embrace government violence as a way of making sure that people live a better life, which obviously is a contradiction. And when you get away from that, you're getting closer and closer to paradigms that embrace cooperation, peaceful cooperation, and that's the other half of your book. And again, I was listening to you and Pete talk about this on the Hayek podcast. Kenneth Boulding and others have talked a lot about conflict resolution and peaceful cooperation. And the reason that you and I are classical liberals is that we think that people have an almost infinite capacity, when left free, to get together and solve problems and hash things out and move forward. That's the entire basis of the market process. So how do we go from this Leviathan machine that is just doing just horrible things to people, not only in our own country, but across the globe, to a paradigm that maximizes cooperation?
Yeah, well, the first one, I think, the first thing, which is an intellectual project, but I think like all projects, everything at its core is about ideas and recognizing the possibilities of things. You have to, in order to recognize possibilities in reality, we have to recognize the possibility of those possibilities, and recognize that intellectually It's an alternative. And so the first thing, and even classical liberals, many classical liberals I know, they'll say, okay, government's really bad at education, at healthcare, but we need them, defense, courts, police. Those are kind of the public goods that we need government to provide. Perhaps. But one thing I think we need to take seriously is maybe not. It is at least within the realm of possibility that government, just like all the other kind of critiques we have in other domestic programs, is not the best alternative. So where then does that leave us? Well, one thing to think about is that peace and peacemaking, and this is one of the things I really like about Kenneth Boulding and his wife, Elise Boulding. She was a sociologist who also wrote on peace and culture, what she called cultures of peace, is already all around us. We take it for granted. Just like when we talk about spontaneous order in markets, we say, man, isn't it amazing when we walk into a grocery store and all these products around us, and it's so ordinary to us that we take it for granted and we don't think about it. But when we do step back and think about it, even one item, what it entails to actually get that to the shelf, it's just staggering intellectually. And then you think about all this stuff. And we complain, when our Amazon Prime package comes a day late. That's like the kind of things we complain about because we're so used to this. Well, the same logic applies to peace. One of the things that the Bouldings pointed out was that in our ordinary life, we face conflict on a regular basis, and conflict is not the same as violence. One of the things they highlighted is that conflict is ubiquitous. You wake up in the morning and you go to make a cup of coffee, and so does your significant other. And you have a K cup, 1 cup, and who's going to make it first?
I know how that goes.
Yeah, exactly.
At my house,
or who's going to get to pick what movie or what restaurant or what trip to take? These are all situations where there's conflicting interests. We don't think about them that way because we resolve them. We could resort to violence. Violence is one means of deciding who gets to make the cup of coffee first or who gets to control the TV remote. But most of us, there are exceptions, of course, most of us in our daily life don't do that. Most of us in our daily life, if we walk down the street and bump into someone by accident, we don't turn around and physically assault them. We typically apologize, and so do they. And once you realize this, you realize, number one, that peaceful navigation of conflict is a possibility. And then, of course, people will say, well, no, those are great little one-off examples, but we're talking the world and the nation. But there's a couple of things to realize. One is that the nations are ultimately derived from a collection of individuals. And so one of the mistakes that people make when they talk about government controlling and creating orders, they talk about it as if it's abstract from the people in the country. Notice what that does. Again, you can't have liberalism. It's inherently authoritarian. If government is separate from the people and acting upon them, that's an authoritarian regime. But that's how we define it versus some kind of self-governing liberal democracy. But on top of that, we also do see larger scale examples of peacemaking. I'm reading a fascinating history right now of pushback on nuclear testing. There's a historian by the name of Lawrence Whitner is his name, and I came across this, and I was completely unaware about this. I knew there had been pushback and protest throughout the world, but his argument is that we have nuclear weapons. They are the most destructive tool on the face of the earth. They can annihilate much of humankind multiple times over. So it's hard to think about something more destructive than that. And they're not used. And most people's response is, see, the reason they're not used is because we have nuclear weapons. So the standard deterrence argument. And he says, well, that can't explain everything because there are numerous instances in history where nuclear powers could have used nuclear weapons against people that didn't have nuclear weapons and didn't. And his argument, and he's not a classical liberal, but he's a historian, and he's writing about the movement, is that people power, these pushbacks across the globe, scientists, but also as ordinary citizens who were highly concerned with the devastation that nuclear weapons could do to fellow human beings, but also the planet in general, got together and organized what we would call civil society and put so much pressure on governments that both democracies, but also authoritarian governments, were limited in using them. And he has documentation. So he has access to documents where they're, internal memos where they're saying we can't do nuclear testing because there's so much public outcry. And when I read this, or as I am reading it, it's quite shocking to me because here's a decentralized. No one was like, I'm the central planner of the anti-nuclear movement. We're all going to get together. There were all these local leaders. They came from all different backgrounds. Some of them were socialists. Some of them were environmentalists. Some of them were libertarians. So, all different backgrounds. But they were able to come together, create these groups, create newsletters, and put supreme and extreme pressure, I should say, on political leaders to prevent them from using nuclear weapons. And to my way of thinking, that's an amazing phenomena that gets neglected when you say, we have nukes and they have nukes, so we have peace. And it makes you think, well, what's really doing the work here to generate the peace?
Yeah.
And so then you take that logic, and Boulding had this, Kenneth Boulding. He's a great writer. He's very accessible for an economist or for an academic in general. But he has these funny little kinds of phrases or terms used. And what he called it Boulding's first law. And he said Boulding's first law is if something exists, it must be true, which of course is cute, but it's also quite powerful. And his point being that I observe peace throughout my daily life, therefore peace is possible. We just have to have the ability to intellectually recognize it. And then once we recognize the possibility, then it's a matter of thinking about what alternatives exist to leverage that up in different areas. And that completely shifts the paradigm, because you recognize that you do not need to be reliant on top-down monocentric government for order. It's exactly the opposite. That government oftentimes squelches those things because they say, no, you ordinary people, you're not good enough to do this. You need to rely on us. And it pushes out the ability of people to do those things.
If you've made it this far into the show, it means I must be doing something right. Kibbe on Liberty is just one of the amazing products we create at Free the People. We tell emotionally compelling stories and produce educational videos for the liberty curious. Our award-winning documentaries personalize all things liberty, independence, creativity, hard work, integrity, and perseverance. After the show, check out our work at freethepeople.org. And if you like what you see, donate to support what we do. That's freethepeople.org. Now back to the show. Yeah, it fundamentally hijacks it, and that's sort of the white pill in this conversation. And that specific story to me reminds me of something more generally. I talk about this conflict between the deep state and the centralization of power, and they're trying to stop people from thinking for themselves and speaking for themselves and organizing. All of these attacks on technology and social media, I think, arose from the fact that people had these new tools. They started using them, as free people do, and that was undermining the monolithic power of the people in charge. So it's kind of this monumental clash between freedom and cooperation and the spontaneous emergence of order and rules and peace versus the people that sort of profiteer off of us fighting with each other.
Certainly. And so again, it comes back to this control over information, which again shouldn't be surprising. A lot of people that are not sympathetic to the idea or don't think about it hear deep state and it's like, oh, that's a conspiracy. I mean, think about it. What do authoritarian regimes do? What's like the first thing they do? Or what happens when you see a coup happen? They take over media. There's a reason authoritarian regimes have state-owned media. Now, their logic is, well, we're the experts, we have the information, and we need to communicate it to you. Okay, maybe, in which case you might say, well, just have competition and you'd win out in the competition if you're so great at it. But really what they want to do is control the flow of information so that there can be no deviations from the party line. And when you realize that, okay, once you get into a position of power, you got to control information. So does the United States have a free media? Well, certainly on many margins it does. Certainly relative to other countries it does. But in many ways, there are moves that are currently being made that are being revealed with all the stuff with Twitter and everything. But again, going back decades, where you see blatant efforts to control information. Again, not long ago, the U.S. government they didn't even try to hide it. Like, what's the Creel Committee? It is the attempt to control information propaganda during the World War. Because the American people had to know what was going on. And what does every single piece of information say? America's winning. America's great. Without America, there's no freedom, democracy. If you don't support this, your kids are gonna die and the world will go to hell in a handbasket.
So do you think modern corporate media, and I think about it maybe a little bit differently than you are, because I've read some of your work on this, but do you think modern corporate media is more captured by government, or has it always been this way?
I think it's a matter of degree. So I think there's always been some political influence or attempt to influence media. I think that's a constant as long as government exists. I think we see that. I think through time that ebbs and flows, and the nature of it ebbs and flows. And so even corporate media now, I think there are parts that I think there's government capture that I'm not, and government influence, but I don't think even in those areas that are influenced, it's completely controlled. So I don't think that, I don't think there's someone in government that tells the New York Times everything that appears in the New York Times. I don't think there's someone in a back room writing it and then I think there's some space for dissent, for critique. But here's what I also think. I think there, and we know this now with like Facebook, I think there are people that will say at times, hey, we need you to do this.
Yeah.
And also the incentives, the way, because politics.
Well, I've actually read those emails. Elon Musk has released them.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we know this, and it happens during wars all the time. Mm-hmm. And of course, again, we were talking about whistleblowers earlier. Go back to the famous Ellsberg case. They're trying to block publication in newspapers, of course, of the information that's revealed. So, secrecy, control of information, it certainly exists. My response to that is the best we have is contestability. That's the best we can do. Constraining government, as long as government exists in this space, is not going to happen.
Yeah.
So the best you can have is contestability, diversity of views, but it really then comes down, which is, one of the really fascinating things to think about is what does it require to be a citizen in a free society? And it actually requires a lot. It's a very heavy burden. And thinkers have recognized this for centuries. You can't just be some passive actor. You certainly can't engage in what's called parentalism, not paternalism, where government imposes things on you, but parentalism, where you actually ask government to take care of you as if you're a child, because then the game's over. At least under paternalism, when government says, you're doing X, if you push back, you have some recourse, at least there's that pushback. You're not voluntarily complying. But when people turn to government and simply say, do this for me because I'm helpless, the game's over.
Yeah.
And that's my big concern with this stuff, with the defense stuff. It's that when we think about it, that government must do it or else, it basically turns us into children. Just like a child needs their parent to take care of them because otherwise they starve or they don't have shelter or clothing. When we treat government that way, the game's over. And so going back to our media discussion, contestability, innovation, I think those are our hope.
I actually took, as I thought about, first I was outraged, but as I thought about these extraordinary new infrastructure, apparently like a bunch of agents at the FBI were reading our tweets, right? And they're flagging them, even down to, some poor guy with 15 followers told a joke about the election, and he was flagged. It seems so extraordinarily un-American, a violation of the First Amendment, all that stuff. But it also strikes me as quite desperate, that they're incredibly worried that they've again lost control of the media narrative, and in some ways, I think they've very much captured corporate media, but you also have this revolution of outsiders. I'm thinking at this moment of someone like Glenn Greenwald, certainly Joe Rogan platforms, guys that tell your sort of story about interventionism and the disasters that happen abroad. And he's bigger than CNN and MSNBC and I think Fox. I looked at these numbers, like, one podcast is bigger than what these guys get in a week. And I might have butchered that number slightly, but it's extraordinarily big.
Right.
Just this one guy. And then you add all of these other, the real journalism, I think, is coming from these renegades like Glenn Greenwald.
Yeah, sure. If anything else, it's competitive pressure, which I think is always a good thing. Because the other thing that happens is when you get, even if you're not maliciously trying to manipulate people, when you are reliant on politicians and policymakers because you need them, they control access. And so, this is one of the things I've talked about in my work on propaganda with war reporting, is that one of the things that where media tends to become an extension or an appendage to government is that government puts them in certain positions. So they'll embed them with certain troops that do certain things, but they're not going to embed them with troops that do other things. They limit their access to things. But also the threat is always you're not going to get access to the gatekeepers if you say something bad. And so that's a very strong check. And that's why I think the kind of people it's a check on being critical is what I'm saying, which is then I think why it's important, the kind of things you're highlighting about these opportunities for these kind of, I don't know if you want to call them renegade, but entrepreneurs, let's call them, people that see a space for intellectual content that doesn't exist and see an audience for it and then provide it. And just think about it, like that's a relatively recent phenomena to be able to have those kind of platforms. And so that's a great thing. So the more contestability, the better is my view on information. Again, it takes a lot of kind of wherewithal and a willingness for the citizenry to be aware from that and to sort through it. Because, of course, the critique back is, well, then you can get a lot of bad information too. And yeah, of course. But you get that from government too. It's not like you centralize information control and you only get good information.
Yeah, I feel like the flow of bad information was there before we had these new tools. And this is my argument for optimism for classical liberals is these tools for all of the censorship and all of the shadow banning and all these things that are absolutely happening. These tools allow us to have conversations like this, and the access to the substantial academic research paradigms that are coming out of the Hayek Center at George Mason University. That used to be a silo. Like you would actually have to go to Mason and listen to a Boulding lecture or something, or listen to Buchanan and stuff like that. And now you have the opportunity to reach potentially everybody that cares.
Yep.
And most people don't necessarily know they care until there's some sort of like nugget or seed or idea that sparks their interest. So I think we have an opportunity to do that. Before we wrap up, let's talk. First of all, talk about the whole research paradigm, because this is the, I guess, fifth book so far, and I didn't know this either, but you started graduate school at Mason a couple weeks before 9/11.
Yeah, that's right. And before that, I lived in New York City. So I grew up in northern New Jersey. I went to Manhattan College in New York City for undergraduate. That's where I met Pete Boettke. He taught at Manhattan for 1 year in between NYU and Mason. So my junior year, my third year, that's how I got introduced to economics and these ideas, and that's why I fell in love with them. But what I did right after I graduated from Manhattan, so Pete moved to Mason my senior year. I worked down on Wall Street at JP Morgan. And so for a while, I lived in the city for a year after undergrad, and then I moved to Hoboken, New Jersey. If you don't know, it's across the river, and I would take the PATH train to the World Trade Center. So, I was doing that, Hoboken into the PATH train or walk to Wall Street for over a year, and I left there to come down to Mason. And then, of course, I started in 2001, and September 11th happened. So I just come from being right around the World Trade Centers, having grown up 20 minutes outside New York City, and then to GMU. The attack happens, and prior to that, I already had liberal or libertarian leanings, certainly. And I understood libertarian foreign policy.
That forced yellow.
Yeah, that's right, in grammar school.
Yeah.
And even though I have to say, for much of my life, I was kind of apolitical. I didn't have strong opinions either way. I didn't think about it. But in any case, the U.S. invasion of Iraq and then Afghanistan happens. And it was actually a conversation. I was Tyler Cowen's research assistant. And one day I was just chatting with him in his office, no one is talking about what is required to rebuild a nation. Like basics, like what I consider basic stuff that we were talking about earlier. Like, what would you need to know to design a liberal society? It's not like you just sit down and say, here's a copy of the U.S. Constitution, just follow this and voila. That worked for a little bit at least. You'll get that too. Or, what are these incentives that these bureaucrats but also regional actors are all facing? Anyway, that became my dissertation, which was turned into my first book then. It was called After War, about nation building. And then it's kind of gone from there. And I focused initially on efforts to intervene abroad. Then I started focusing on domestic effects. And this book I view kind of as the culmination of tying those things together. And now where I'm shifting more of my focus is into the where we just ended up and where the last chapter ends up, which is let's talk now about peacemaking and what are all the different ways that we can think about alternatives to the state that already exist, but also that might exist if we give people space to figure things out for generating peace. And so that's kind of where I'm pushing now.
I would love to talk about that because I had Deirdre McCloskey on the show, and I was asking her to help me sort of flesh out this reimagining of the political spectrum. So like we're told left and right, and I don't buy that at all because Pol Pot is not somehow a better person than Adolf Hitler. Like I feel like they're sort of the same monster. And so I have all of these deadly isms below the center line, and above that I'm trying to avoid, like, I'm not going to use a word like libertarianism because it's an ism, but I want to use values instead, like tolerance and cooperation. And we decided at the top of that spectrum, and this will sound a little hippy-dippy, but I think it's absolutely true, is love. And there's a lot of trust and relationships that go to that authentic thing. So I think the entire process you're describing is worthy of this, because I don't think people realize it. Like, it sounds ridiculous to, in some sense, particularly if you spend too much time on Twitter, that we could actually cooperate and empathize and figure each other out and work things out. But it's all around us. Like, this is what we do every day.
Yep. And McCloskey refers to this, of course, a key part of this is sweet talk or persuasion, the ability to communicate with other people. And that's one of the things that we need to get away from and shift, is that when you have the kind of mentality that exists now in the American empire, you're communicating, but what you're communicating is force. So you think of something like Taiwan, all right? And we can all recognize the tension there. So that's the other thing, like, discussing this doesn't mean that somehow you are just saying, yeah, whatever happens is great, or when bad people do other things to other human beings, I applaud that. But when you start sending members of Congress over to Taiwan, that communicates something.
Yeah.
And it's not communicating, well, can we talk? Can I persuade you not to do something or to take a different path by recognizing the mutual benefits? And maybe that's not possible, just like it may not be possible in daily interactions, but it also might be. And by forcing that off the table, by saying, by aggregating people into a nation and saying China or Russia can't do this or we can't do that, they're our enemy, you're communicating, but you're communicating a negative sum situation by definition and removing the possibility of communication. And if you just, as a good thought experiment, think about if you acted that way in your daily life, it would be horrible. Our daily interactions with not just members of our family, but just in the world, mundane interactions would be terrible if we acted that same way. Yeah. And we don't, because we recognize, as you put it quite nicely, the benefits of cooperation and respect for other people.
We got to wrap up, but let's talk a little bit about resources for people that are interested in this stuff. I don't even know what your title is, but you're ex at the Hayek Center, Mercatus, George Mason University.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of economics in the Department of Economics at George Mason. That's my main affiliation. But then we have the Hayek program for the advanced study for philosophy, politics, and economics. And I'm the associate director. Pete Becky, who we mentioned earlier, is the director. And we do a whole host of wonderful activities. You mentioned we have a podcast, and the podcast now has just taken off, and we have because there's not just one person doing it. All of my colleagues in the Hayek program have the opportunity to talk to people that interest them, and so anyone.
And it's called the Hayek podcast.
Yeah. And then there's kind of subcategories depending on interests, and so I'm planning one. I haven't done it yet, but I'm planning to do a series on these issues of peace, for instance, where I'm going to talk to people that are focused on this. And so it's all on the Hayek program website if people are interested in that. We also have student fellowship programs, both for students that come to Mason, but also for graduate students, masters and PhD who are external that want to come and visit 3 weekends out of the year and sit around and talk ideas. And then we also have undergraduate online. It's called the Lavoie Fellowship, where we meet over Zoom and talk about ideas. And we're just launching in a couple months. We'll see how it goes. A new high school program. It's part of the Lavoie Fellowship, and we're kicking it off to talk about some of these ideas with ambitious high school students. And so I'm excited to see where that goes. And I love it because in addition to getting to work on these ideas and talk to my colleagues about them, I also get to interact with hundreds of young people ranging from prior college, now high school starting soon, all the way up through PhDs who are interested and excited in these ideas from all different backgrounds, all different ideological persuasions, but they all share kind of an ambition and hunger for intellectual discussion. So it's a great life.
I'm kind of jealous that those resources exist today, because I had to stumble across these books purely by accident, and I lost so much time finding this.
Yeah,
and
certainly.
Now you can get it in high school. That's amazing. And you are on social media?
I am. I have my website's ccoyne.com. I'm on Twitter. ccoyne1, I think, is my handle. And
yeah, I found you this morning. So
yep.
Cool. Well, thanks for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure speaking with you as always.
Let's keep doing.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.